Okay, today we're talking about physical health. This is cultural psych. Physical health, it's chapter 13, physical health and culture. As weird as this may sound, culture has a lot to do with how you respond to certain medications. As an example, let me think of one of the a good example. Some African Americans are more sensitive to sulfa drugs than European Americans. In other words, they can't take them because they have an adverse reaction to it. It seems to be genetic. We didn't know it was there until the Korean War, when we had a lot of combat troops who were. It was the first war that we allowed African Americans to participate in combat, and after we had sulfa drugs. And what we discovered is sometimes if you give select individuals from select cultural or racial groups select medications such as sulfa drugs with African Americans, they don't respond well to it. It doesn't heal them for one thing, and it doesn't act as an antibiotic, and they have an adverse reaction. The adverse reaction has to do with their thyroid, if I'm not mistaken. Anyway, they have a thyroid malfunction, and nobody realized this. They were killing off all these soldiers that were wounded, and of course, you put antibiotics on their wound to keep it as sanitized as you possibly can. And these guys were coming in with raging fevers and whatnot, despite the fact that the wound shouldn't have caused that much trouble. And of course, the problem was that they were allergic to it. There were North Africans that had the same problem, or people of North African descent. Select Italians and Spanish and Greeks had the same problem, and Turks. So it was one of the things that we needed to think about. Before that, I mean, you like to think that everybody's the same and we're all average. Everybody is average and nobody is different. That skin tone has nothing to do with anything. It really doesn't. But the reality is that there are people that react differently to select drugs. Genetic variability in humans is considerably less than in many other species, given how recently modern humans emerged as species. Modern humans first emerged approximately 200,000 years ago, and they all lived in Africa until about approximately 50 to 60,000 years ago, when some of them migrated elsewhere. And as you can see, if we look at people, they all look pretty much the same. The only difference is that their skin tone tends to be a little bit different. Now, why in the world would somebody's skin tone, why would one person have a darker skin tone than another? And the answer is has to do with sunlight, how much sunlight that you need to filter out. So the people that were living in sunnier environments tended to be darker complexioned, and people who were living in cloudier conditions and colder conditions, these individuals tended to not need the melanin nearly as much to filter the sun. Humans have become so dependent on cultural information to survive that culture has become a selective force on their biological nature. Humans are said to be a product of culture gene coevolution, as they have both evolved biological predispositions to depend on cultural information, and this cultural information enhances their fitness as it continues to evolve. Some people have told me that Navajos have a taboo against eating seafood. They don't eat fish. Other individuals have told me that that's not true. Another group that doesn't eat fish are the Apaches. Another Athabascan-speaking group, and there are select bands of Apaches that do not eat fish, or will not eat fish. It's the way it works. Is this because at one point they were eating tainted fish and people got sick, Who knows? Some individuals are lactose intolerant. A lot of American Indians are lactose intolerant. A lot of Asians are lactose intolerant. A lot of European Americans are lactose intolerant. Why is this? Well, it's mainly because they didn't consume dairy products at select times during their lives. A common domain in which we see evidence for this selection is cultural differences in dietary practices, such as milk consumption. Different cultures vary in what they regularly eat, and long-term persistent changes in dietary practices have been accompanied by genetic evolution that maximizes the effectiveness of the nutrition that people derive from their diets. When I was young, I lived in Indiana, of course, and Indiana is something of a dairy state. Used to be something of a dairy state. There used to be a lot of dairy cattle, and we used to sell our milk to Illinois and Kentucky and Ohio, and not Wisconsin. Wisconsin has all the dairy they need, but we sold it out of state. And since there were so many milk producers in Indiana, we used to get free milk whenever they had a surplus. If they bottled too much and they couldn't sell it, they would bring it to the schools and they would feed it to us. They weren't purchasing the milk, it was being donated to us. And because of that, we probably drank more milk than most people did, than city people did. And that was because of the surplus that we had in the state. When I was young, I can remember that for a carton of milk, an 8-ounce carton of milk, it cost 3 cents. And that was either chocolate milk or white milk. And there was a milk dispenser on every floor, so you could, in between classes or before you went out to recess, you could drink yourself a carton of milk if you had 3 cents. And then they raised it to 5 cents. Not that that's important, but then once upon a time, Cokes were only 5 cents for one of those 6 and I don't know, those small bottles of Coca-Cola used to only be a nickel as well. Humans vary in the amount of starch that they eat. In general, people in agricultural societies consume more starch than those in most foraging societies. And the people from cultures in which a lot of starch has traditionally been consumed are more likely to have a genetic mutation that increases the amount of amylase protein in their saliva, which helps to digest starch. And this is according to Perry et al. In 2007. So what are starches? Most of your grains are starches. Corn has a lot of starch. Wheat certainly has a lot of starch. And potatoes, of course. And potatoes, of course, came from here. They were up in the Incas, is where the potatoes developed. Corn developed in Mesoamerica, in Central America, with the Mayans, and then it spread all throughout the Americas. And those are very starchy foods. Now, the wonderful thing about starch is that it has a lot of energy in it. So if you eat a lot of starch, then you're potentially going to need less food and need less red meat. In West Africa, populations of Kwa-speaking farmers started to grow yam crops, which required them to clear the forests. One inadvertent side effect of this cultural practice was that it increased the amount of standing water after a rain, creating a better habitat for malaria-carrying mosquitoes. Malaria then spread in these regions and led to the evolution of a particular genetic variant for hemoglobin that is associated with sickle-cell anemia, which has the benefit of making one more resistant to developing malaria. So what we saw was that due to the malaria, this hemoglobin variant developed, and to this day you can check people of African descent to see if they have the sickle cell anemia trait. If we have two individuals, of course, there's no law that says two individuals with the malaria or the sickle cell trait can't get married, but the reality is that 1 out of every 4 of their children will potentially have sickle cell anemia. Of course, if they lived in Africa, one of their children would die from sickle-cell anemia, one of their children would die from malaria, and two of their children would be immune to malaria, as weird as that sounds. So if they had 8 children, 2 of them would have died from malaria, 2 of them would have died from sickle-cell anemia, and the other 4 children would have survived. Researchers around the world have attempted to identify different genetic variables that might lead to social sensitivity. 5-HTTL-PR, A118G, and MAOA are alleles that have been found in Asian samples but not European samples. Could they have something to do with social sensitivity? Now, this is really kind of fascinating because we're going to talk about differences between European Americans and Asians. A genetic variant that is associated with increased emotional support seeking in times of distress for European Americans is associated with decreased emotional support seeking from Koreans. A variant that is associated with increased attention to foreground objects among European Americans shows the opposite effect among Koreans. A variant that leads to better responses to antidepressants among Caucasians leads to worse responses among Koreans and Japanese. So here we are, we're creating Prozac, and it works on people in the United States, but it doesn't work on people from Korea, and it doesn't work on Japanese. And of course, we're talking about the SSRIs. A variant associated with decreased emotion suppression among European Americans predicted increased emotional expression among Koreans. Now, this is really kind of fascinating because we've talked about, I don't know if we talked about it or not, we talked about the fact that among Americans, the average, if we look at 30-year-olds and we look at the number of 30-year-olds who have never had sex before, the ones that are virgins, we find less than 5%. But if we look at Japanese and we look at the number of virgins among the 30-plus-year-old group, it's closer to 25 to 30%. Now, why in the world is this? Well, here we're talking about more serotonin. We're talking about serotonin, and we see that, and serotonin, of course, balances your sexual desires in your hypothalamus. Testosterone gives you your sex drive, and serotonin regulates your sex drive in your hypothalamus. And here we're talking about the fact that Koreans and Japanese don't have the same serotonin structure that people from Caucasians from the United States have. Studies that included a sample of Korean Americans who were genetically more similar to Koreans but culturally more similar to European Americans showed a pattern of results that were more similar to those of European Americans, demonstrating that cultural experiences can actually shape how genes are expressed in the body. There you go, epigenetics. So if a Korean is raised in the United States, potentially they'll have the same level of all of these things, and one of them being sex drive, of course. But if they're raised in Korea, they have less of they will have, that gene will not be expressed, so their sex drive will be different. So potentially people raised in the United States, of course, genetically, this gene is turned on, and therefore they have a stronger sex drive. Dutch men average 6'1". That is today, they average 6'1". They're 3 inches taller than the average American man, who stands at just under 5'10". In 1865, American men averaged 5'8", which was 3 inches taller than the average Dutch man at the time. So the average person raised in the United States was fairly tall. They were 5'8". That's the height of my son right now. In the late 19th century, on average, Americans were among the tallest in the world, reflecting their relative advantage in income. Their gross natural product per capita was the 3rd highest in the world. At that time, American men stood 1 inch taller than Britons, the same height as Australians, 2 inches taller than Norwegians, 3 inches taller than the French, 4 inches taller than Italians, and more than 7 inches taller than the Japanese. South Korean children are about 5 inches taller than their North Korean counterparts. Japanese immigrants to California in the 1950s were about 5 inches taller than their compatriots in Japan. Dairy consumption in particular has been linked to height. And of course, as you can see, we have, these are Japanese living in Hawaii, and those are their Japanese relatives that have come over to visit them. And as you can see, they're much taller. The two on the right are much taller than the individuals on the left. Actually, that's our left and our right. Anyway, it may have to do with dairy products because the more dairy products you consume puts more calcium in your system, and therefore you are more likely to grow tall. As far as the South Korean and the North Korean children, North Korea has been had problems with nutrition lately. There are people that are starving to death in the streets. Not so with South Korea, one of the richest countries in the world. So the children in South Korea are getting a lot of food, and the children in North Korea are starving. They have famine in North Korea. Japanese and Korean adults report sleeping about an hour less per day than French adults do. Moreover, these cultural differences are not just evident among adults. A systematic study of infants and toddlers in 17 countries around the world found that Japanese infants sleep about 1.5 hours less than North American infants. Infants from Asian countries were found to sleep much less than infants from Western countries, and this may have something to do with why Asians are shorter than people from other places in the world. Dutch infants were found to sleep about 1.3 hours more than American infants. People in countries at the extreme of the sleep spectrum, the Japanese and the Netherlands, have a pronounced difference in the amount of sleep, the amount that they sleep. Japanese, European Canadians, and Asian Canadians were provided biometric measurements to measure their sleep. My wife has one of these. She has sleep apnea, so she has to check to see if she's sleeping with the CPAP machine. And she does. She checks her sleep pattern every night. Japanese participants slept about 1.2 hours less than the 2 Canadian samples. Asian Canadians slept similarly to European Canadians, showing that it actually is cultural. So people living in Canada sleep longer than the Japanese. Now, the interesting thing is, of course, Japanese live longer than any other group. Japanese participants indicated that their ideal amount of sleep was about an hour less than that reported by the Canadians. The Canadians described themselves as feeling more tired during the day, even though they were sleeping more than the Japanese. Until recently, socioeconomic status was invisible to health researchers. Research in 1984 of English civil servants were divided into 4 class categories. The researchers found that compared with top administrators, members of the executive class were 60% more likely to die over the 10-year period. The clerical staff was 120% more likely to die, and the unskilled laborers were 170% more likely to die. When we're talking about civil servants, we're talking about people that work for the government, such as the police force. Despite the fact that these were very large differences, they have been replicated in many industrialized countries. It is actually larger than smokers and non-smokers. We talk about not smoking and you can add years to your life, but the reality is the better your job, the longer you're going to live. The same thing was observed in Denmark. Same thing was observed in Norway. The same thing was observed in Finland. The same thing was observed in France. The same thing was observed in Japan. And the same thing was observed in New Zealand. In the United States, almost every increase in income reduces mortality rates, and these differences emerge even among those incomes at the highest levels. And here you can see Depending on how wealthy you are, you can see that the highest incomes, their death rates are much lower. They're almost half of what the people in the low incomes are. The Fulani, Mosi, and Ramabe all live in northeast Burkina Faso. And Burkina Faso is this red place right here. It's just below the Sahara Desert. The region is endemic with malaria, which is a major cause of death in the area. The Mosi and the Ramabe have been living in this region for thousands of years and have developed much genetic resistance to malaria over time. The Fulani moved to this region in the early 19th century as part of the Islamic invasion of sub-Saharan Africa. The Fulani have not developed much genetic resistance to malaria. The Fulani are the dominant ethnic group in the area, mainly because they conquered them and forced everybody to accept Islam. When the Fulani first arrived, they conquered, enslaved, and decultured the other ethnic groups in the area, including the Mosai and the Ramabe. The higher status that they have as conquerors appears to provide them with enough health benefits to more than make up for their genetic vulnerability to malaria. Your health may be seriously compromised if you don't have enough money to pay for adequate health care. In the British civil servant study, all of the workers had the same access to state-provided health care, yet there were still pronounced differences. People lower in socioeconomic status are more likely to have jobs that place them in hazardous situations, such as having to deal with poisonous toxins that make them vulnerable to workplace accidents. People in the lower socioeconomic status groups are more likely to smoke, to eat a poor diet, and they are less likely to exercise. Chronically stressed people are more likely to engage in health-compromising behaviors, such as smoking and drinking in order to cope with their difficulties in their lives, and stress directly weakens the immune system's ability to fight off infections and manage other threats. One of the things we're noticing with the outbreak of COVID-19 is that it is affecting minorities at a higher rate. I just watched a video from CNN talking about how devastating COVID-19 is on the Navajo Nation on the Navajo reservation. Some of the information coming out of Chicago and New York is that it's affecting African Americans at a much higher rate than it is affecting anybody else. And this has to do with socioeconomic status. Socioeconomic status has to do with stress. And the more stress that you're under, the weaker your immune system tends to be. People who feel that they do not have much control in their jobs tend to have a higher risk of heart disease. Low levels of control are more generally associated with poor physical functioning and an increased likelihood of illness. One study by Lockman and Weaver in 1998 found that although lower socioeconomic status people have worse health outcomes, those with lower socioeconomic status who felt that they had much control in their lives had levels of health and well-being that were comparable with those in higher income groups. Now, this is really kind of interesting because, of course, I've been around for 70 years. And when I was first born in the 1940s, 1949, and in the 1950s, one of the things that I noticed was that African Americans were denigrated. African Americans were the civil rights movement hadn't started yet. It had started in select parts of the country, like in Harlem and New York City, but the rest of the country hadn't really picked up the civil rights movement. One of the really positive things about the civil rights movement that really moved it forward had to do with the Black is Beautiful movement. And after that, of course, things kind of took off. But of course, that whole idea that African Americans should take control of their lives really changed the way that people reacted to other individuals. They were less subordinate. They didn't accept subordination as readily, and because of that, of course, the health rate of African Americans has really increased, and that's a really positive thing. Stress and feelings of a lack of control tend to be more pronounced among those who occupy a subordinate position and are subject to the demands of those who are able to make decisions for them. One of the things that we noticed coming out of Vietnam, and I mentioned this before, but one of the things that we noticed coming out of Vietnam was the individuals who suffered from PTSD the most were the individuals who were of the lower ranks. What does that have to do with anything? Well, they had no control over what happened to them. If they were told that they had to march through the mud and cross this swamp, they couldn't argue and say, let's just go around. They didn't have control over anything. And for this reason, of course, the stress level for those select individuals was so much higher than individuals who were NCOs or were officers. So it was the lower enlisted ranks that had the most severe PTSD during the Vietnam War. And it had to do with the amount of control that they had over themselves. This is not just true of humans. Research with various another about Vietnam. I have a brother that was in combat. He was a combat engineer, and they were sent down a road one day, and my brother and several of the other individuals that had been in country for an extended length of time knew that this was prime ambush country, and that if they had actually walked down the road, that the probability of being ambushed was very, very high. That was the reason that they were going, was because that they knew that there were North Vietnamese in the area. So my brother suggested to the officer that instead of walking down the road, that they send squads around to flank the road, so that if they were attacked, that they would be able to come up behind them and counterattack. And of course, the officer said, "No, my orders are for us to walk down the road." My brother decided that he didn't want to die, so he slipped away. And of course, they didn't look for them. They just kept marching down the road. And here he took a squad of individuals, and he did exactly what he said the officer should have done. He was able to come up behind a group of individuals. They were actually moving faster than the guys on the road, and they were able to actually come up behind a group of North Vietnamese that were laying in ambush for them. And as soon as the firing started, they attacked from the rear, and of course the North Vietnamese were really spooked, since they were pinned in between two different forces, and they were being hit in crossfire, and they surrendered. Well, my brother had disobeyed a direct order, and he would have gotten in a lot of trouble if he hadn't saved the day. But of all my brothers, of course, he's the one that has the worst PTSD, and it's mainly because he had a jackass for a commanding officer. Just kind of an interesting thought. This is not just true of humans, of course. We're talking about lack of control causing health issues. Research with various primates has revealed that those individuals who are subordinate in a hierarchy experience greater stress hormone levels when the society is ruled by intimidation. And we're looking at this right now. I had two cats in Say Lee, and when I came home, I brought them, of course. The idea was I was only going to be here for a week, and then we're going to take them back, and it wouldn't be that big a deal. But now I've been here for 6 weeks, and we're seeing a lot of dynamic behavior between all of the animals. Two of them are tomcats, and they are pretty much fighting all the time, and the reason they're fighting all the time is because they're trying to determine who's the alpha male and which one is subordinate. And we're about to reach a point of balance, I think. One of them's bigger than the other one, but one of them's old. The other one is older. The smaller one is older than the than the large one. Anyway, it's kind of a balance. They kind of yell at each other here lately, but they haven't really fought. Before every time they saw each other, they were really tangling, but now not so much. The high stress hormones are especially true when subordinate primates are unable to easily avoid dominant individuals and when they have low availability of social support. What these two individuals are doing now is they try to stay away from each other. So they are avoiding each other, whichever one is dominant. The societal features that result in the greatest degree of stress among subordinates in various primate populations are remarkably similar to the situation in which many low socioeconomic status people find themselves in modernized, industrialized societies. Feeling poor can matter as much as actually being poor. The experience of relative deprivation of knowing that others are doing better than you might lead to stress and its associated negative health consequences. This is really kind of bizarre. So if I'm living in a very wealthy community, I only make $500,000 a year, and everybody else around me makes millions of dollars. The stress that I would feel would be just as bad as if I only made $30,000 a year. Uh, so it has to do with the environment that you live in. If you live in an environment where you are the lowest of the individuals in the area, then you're going to feel a lot more stress than the individuals that pick up the garbage or the individuals that do the gardening. They're not going to feel nearly as much stress because they don't compare themselves with all the people in this area. They compare themselves with their neighbors back wherever they come from. So it all depends on who you are and where you are as to how you feel about how poor you feel and how much stress you feel from the fact that you don't have as much money as the people around you. There is a clear relation between the absolute wealth of a nation and the average life expectancy of its citizens. This is true up to a gross domestic product per capita figure of approximately $30,000 a year. And as you can see, who are we talking about? We're talking about the people in Greece, people in Russia, China, India, Ghana, and Afghanistan make a lot less money than we do in the United States. But the people, everybody above Korea, Norway, Singapore, United States, Netherlands, Ireland, Canada, Australia, Germany, and on, all of those individuals, they feel about the same. Above the per capita gross domestic product of $30,000 a year, the curve largely flattens out, suggesting very little relation between absolute wealth and life expectancy. We've got a president that used to brag about having $7 billion. He doesn't brag about how much money he has anymore. But the reality is that do you feel lesser than him? Do you feel like he has something that you don't have? Probably not. As Americans, of course, I'm comfortable making the amount of money that I make a year. So I don't feel like he's any better off than I am. Many of the countries in the flat part of the curve have average incomes that are lower than that of the lowest Americans. Yet these people don't seem to be worse off in terms of health outcomes. And all of this has to do with health. Poor Americans are doing far worse than wealthier Americans. Income and health is actually a relationship between health and one's income relative to those around you. So if you live in a community where you are the poorest person in the community, but you're a lot richer than somebody else somewhere else, then you feel bad and your health is going to suffer from it because you are in your environment, in the environment that you have chosen, you are the lowest. Indians living in the poor province of Kerala have far lower absolute incomes than poor African Americans in the United States. However, people in Kerala outlive African Americans by a substantial degree. The Keralians are poor in absolute terms, but they likely feel less poor because nearly everyone around them is poorer than they are. Poor Americans often earn an income that is not that poor by international standards. However, they are poor compared to their fellow Americans, and their health suffers accordingly. Disadvantaged minorities around the world tend to be of lower socioeconomic status, and they often experience worse health outcomes than those of majority members. In particular, African Americans in the United States suffer from relatively worse health outcomes, and this is what we were saying about the COVID-19 outbreak. It's affecting the African American community much more severely than it is the European American community. It's also affecting the Latino community a little bit worse than it's affecting the Caucasian community. Now, we need to be really careful about this because most of our lawmakers are, surprise, surprise, European Americans. And it may be that as long as their people aren't dying, they're going to overlook what's happening to the minorities in the United States. This is something that happened with the AIDS epidemic. When the AIDS epidemic hit, because it was affecting mostly gay males, a lot of people ignored it. It didn't have anything to do with them. They weren't going to catch it. So we ignored it. It started in the early 80s, and we didn't start doing anything about it until 1985. Well, by this time, a large portion of the gay community had died. The gay community in San Francisco had been decimated. The gay community in New York City had been decimated. And of course, the reason we didn't do anything is because there were a lot of evangelical religious people who didn't like gay people. They saw it as an abomination, and they didn't do anything about it. And they didn't want us to spend any money on it because it was a waste of time. It was God punishing gay people. That was what they said. Looking at the 15 leading causes of death in the United States, African Americans have a higher death rate than that of European Americans for 12 of them. African Americans tend to be of much lower socioeconomic status than the European Americans. Many of the reasons for their higher mortality can likely be explained by the socioeconomic status difference. Respiratory, and the three that they are not higher than European Americans, respiratory diseases, and of course COVID-19 is a respiratory disease, but it's devastating the African American population. Alzheimer's disease, because European Americans live longer, so they're more likely to have problems with Alzheimer's disease, and suicide. And we have known that African Americans don't commit suicide at nearly the rate that European Americans do. European Americans are number 2 in the United States as far as the number of suicides. Number 1, of course, is American Indians. Sorry, I was getting a drink. Infant mortality rates among African Americans are about double that of European Americans. And these differences also hold for those African Americans who are highly educated. It really doesn't matter your education level or your income level. It has to do with your race. And as you can see, we can look at this, and as you can see, 2002, 2004, 13.7 infant deaths per 1,000 births. For non-Hispanic whites, it's 5.7. So it's almost a third. Latinos, it's 5.6. American Indians, it's 8.6. For Asian and Pacific Islanders, it's 4.8. So as you can see, African Americans lose their babies more frequently than other individuals. There was a lady It was she was a singer. She just lost her baby, and she was African American. It's very rare for somebody for a celebrity to have a baby who doesn't survive, but she did. Hypertension is especially high among African American men, and unlike other health outcomes, hypertension rates are slightly higher for African American men with college degrees than they are for African American men with less education. Now, there may be a rationale to that. Now, why in the world would the more educated African American men have more hypertension than African American men with less education? The answer may be that African American men with higher college degrees with more education have to live in a world where there are fewer African Americans, so they feel less supported, and that may have something. They may feel prejudiced a lot, prejudiced more than African Americans who live in an African American community, or they work in it with a lot of other African Americans. The opposite holds true for African American women and for European American men and women. The other thing about African American men is that for some reason, and I hate to even think about what this is, but for some reason they are disliked more than African American women. African American men are considered, as stupid as this sounds, they are considered to be rapists. They are considered to be hypersexual. Their stereotype is that they are not only hypersexual, but they are unrelenting when they try to seduce somebody. This is a myth that has been around since they first brought the African slave to the Americas. Sadly enough, it's been perpetrated by people trying to control them. Unfortunately, and it's just one of the things that it's difficult to deal with, especially if you know very many African American males, just as nice as anybody. I've lived in an African American community where I was certainly a minority, and of course, this was the furthest thing from just about everybody's mind was anything that had to do with rape or hypersexuality. Just doesn't make any sense at all. It's just a stereotype. Compared to European Americans, Latinos tend to have lower mortality rates for 10 of the 15 leading causes of death. This ethnic difference is all the more puzzling because Latinos tend to be of lower socioeconomic status than European Americans, and hence should be expected to suffer worse health outcomes. And this is known as the epidemiological paradox, that Latinos, Hispanics live longer. They have better health outcomes than European Americans do. It just doesn't fit with all the other criteria that we're looking at, with all the other paradigms. The epidemiological paradox does not apply equally to all groups of Latinos. Puerto Ricans do not show some of the same unexplained health benefits as Mexicans, and there are no explanations why. I remember having this conversation when I was in the military. I had friends who were African Americans. I had friends who were Mexicans, Mexican Americans, and I had friends who were Puerto Ricans. And sometimes it's difficult to recognize whether somebody's Puerto Rican or whether somebody is Mexican American. And of course, they hate it when you make that mistake. It's a good way to get punched in the face. So you need to be really careful when you're dealing with somebody who's a Latino or Latina. I had a friend when I was working, where was I? Lubbock, Texas. She was a Puerto Rican. This lady was brilliant. She was really kind of amazing. She didn't speak English. Of course, in Puerto Rico, they don't really speak English. They speak Spanish almost exclusively. And they speak it with a Spanish accent, not with a South American accent, which is kind of fascinating listening to them talk. Anyway, she didn't speak any English at all. And she picked up English, her ability to speak English, in basic training. And basic training was only 8 weeks long. And here this lady picked up a new language, and she spoke it almost without error. Of course, she had a little bit of an accent, but it was really kind of interesting. Anyway, Puerto Ricans don't have the same uh, paradoxical epidemiological paradox doesn't apply to them as it does with the Mexican Americans. Latinos tend to be less likely to drink and smoke than non-Latinos, although they also tend to exercise less. The longer they've lived in the United States, the more likely they are to engage in unhealthy behaviors as they come to drink more, to smoke more, and are more likely to become obese, like this young gentleman who's pretty big and eating, I don't know, is that Sicilian pizza or is that Chicago deep dish pizza? I don't know, but he sure is big. Some cultural factors are more pronounced among Latinos, such as the high value placed on childbearing and a good deal of emotional support provided by the community seem to provide an important health buffer. Latinos derive health benefits from cultural scripts such as simpatica and their unusually high levels of positive effect. Okay, we won't talk about that. In traditional non-Western societies, beliefs in supernatural causes of illnesses are widespread. These range from theories that aggressive spirits such as ghosts cause disease, which is the most widespread theory of disease, to accounts of witchcraft, sorcery, mystical retributions, and sinful violations of taboos causing illnesses. Among the Azande of West Africa, the primary cause of illness is attributed to witchcraft. Some Zande are believed to be witches, and the source of their witchcraft is believed to be a small organ in their bodies, which can be inherited from their parents. Now, I want you to look at this lady's eyes. This is an Azande, young Azande girl. Look how penetrating her eyes are. This is really kind of fascinating. How about her eyes? She's another Zande. The Zande witches do not perform any rites, use any potions, or cast any spells. Rather, witches conduct their witchcraft entirely through their minds. And as we can see, look at the way she's looking at you. How penetrating that is. Look how penetrating that is. As interesting as that is. When a Zande develops a slowly progressing illness, it is believed to be the result of a witch who is consuming the soul of the victim's organs a little bit at a time. When a Zande develops a sudden acute illness, it is believed to be the result of a sorcerer casting a spell on them. As you can imagine, when Western medicine goes into this area, of what country was it? That doesn't say. Anyway, and when Western medicine comes into this area, how in the world would you treat somebody if they thought that diseases were caused by witches and sorcerers? It would be impossible. This is really kind of interesting. These are what Africans look like. You can see how dark they are. But here we have this individual with red hair. See how bright red his hair is? That's not because he dyed it. There are relatively large portions of the African population who have red hair. So you see some African Americans will naturally have red hair. Really kind of bizarre. It doesn't have anything to do with possible white ancestry, redheaded white ancestry. It has to do with the fact that there's a relatively large percentage of Africans who are considered to be brown rather than black, and these individuals tend to have red hair. They are of the Africans. They are considered to be the oldest. The black Africans came from the north and swept through, and they took over the lands from the people that were referred to as Bushmen. And these individuals are lighter complexioned than the black Africans are, and they have brown and reddish hair, as you can see from this individual right here. If you look at his face, you can see that he has different features than these and other individuals. They're different, and his skin is a little lighter toned. As weird as that is, he's wearing the same outfit this guy is. Anyway, in traditional Chinese medicine, a healthy body is one in which the dialectical forces of yin and yang are in balance. Any imbalances ultimately lead to illness. A person who has liver fire will have symptoms such as headaches, flushed face, and anger, and this illness is believed to be caused by having too much yang and not enough yin. In other words, so if you are an individual who gets angry, instead of them thinking that there's a problem, they will think that you have too much yang and not enough yin. And so they will give you a medication to reduce your yang and to increase your yin in order to get you back in balance. Such an imbalance can be corrected by acupuncture, herbal remedies, exercise, diet, and lifestyle. And of course, the first thing they're going to hit is lifestyle. They're going to say, you've been doing the wrong thing, therefore you need to go back to something else. If that doesn't work, if going back and going home or whatever they suggest, if that doesn't work, then they'll try not to exercise so much. They'll try diet, and if that doesn't work, they'll try the herbal remedies. Exercise is not that popular. Of course, the last thing they'll do is acupuncture. Western doctors often disagree with one another. If you've ever been around doctors in a hospital or in any other environment, doctors would rather work alone so that they don't have anybody second-guessing everything that they do. There are rather striking differences between medical practices of the French and American doctors. Now, this is mainly because, remember, the English and the French had been at war for an extended length of time in the 16th, 17th, and 18th and 19th centuries. The French and the English were at war. And for this reason, of course, we came from the United States came from English practices. And because of that, we have stronger connections to English law, to English medicine, than we do to the French law or French medicine. French believe in a concept of terrain or balance. This emphasis on balance shifts drug consumption away from antibiotics and toward various tonics and vitamins that are believed to strengthen the immune system. Long rests and spa visits are also viewed as an important part of the lifestyle that rejuvenates the terrain. That's as far as the French are concerned. Hospital stays are relatively long in France, about double the length of in the United States, for the same procedures, to provide ample time for recuperation. The other interesting thing about the French, and I thought I had it in here someplace, but after reading through my notes, I see that I don't. They actually do send clowns to hospital rooms to make people happier, to make them laugh. And this is exactly what this lady's doing. She has come to the hospital room, and she's going to say silly things, and she's going to act silly, and she's going to wave her arms so that this individual potentially can recuperate faster. And that's the way it's done in France. We don't have clowns that wander around. We can tell this is France. This is really kind of interesting. That's called a roulade. If you look at the window, if you look at the window, this is bomb-proof, as weird as that is. And you see these all over Europe. This is a roulade, and it rolls down. So it forms a metal curtain between the outside and the window. So if something happens on the outside, If there's a tornado, well, they don't have tornadoes or hurricanes, but if something negative happened on the other side, a bomb blew up, it would potentially not come through the window because of this Rolladin. It's fairly thick steel, and all of the windows are like this. So in order to let the sun in, you have to raise the Rolladin up all the way to let the sun in. They don't have curtains. They have these Rolladin. Really kind of different from the United States. In the United States, we put the curtains on the inside. In Europe, they put this Rolladin on the outside to protect the window because, well, it's glass, of course. They don't want to lose it. When the Europeans first came to the Americas, the natives often commented on how badly they smelled. This is because the common medical practice in the 17th century in France stated that bodily secretions offered a layer of protection. So it was considered unhealthy to bathe frequently. So people would bathe maybe 4 or 6 times a year. A year, not a month, not a week. Yeah, a year. And I'll tell you what, the other thing about Europeans is, of course, we have pheromones, and we have a natural odor, or we have an odor anyway. That is something of a sexual odor, but you don't have to think of it that way. It's body odor. So if you're around Europeans too much, if you play sports with European Americans, you'll probably get a bit of a stronger smell coming off the European Americans than you will just about anybody else. African Americans also have an odor about them. This isn't a sexual smell. This is just a natural odor that they have. I've sweat with in American Indian sweats, and I can tell you that I was the stinkiest person in the sweat. And they told me that I was the stinkiest person in the sweat. And you guys don't stink. It's really kind of weird. Or I used to have a running buddy who was native, and we'd be finished, and of course I'd be dripping with sweat, and he wouldn't have the first drop of perspiration on him, and of course I smelled like an old tennis shoe, and he didn't have a negative odor at all. Actually, the odor coming off of him was probably more. It was they use sweetgrass up there, and so they smudge with sweetgrass, and he smelled more like smudge than anything else. In 1976 article in Le Monde, which is a French magazine, it stated that the French hospital patient had the right to a monthly bath and a weekly foot washing. This is in 1976. They're only bathing once a month, and they're only washing their feet once a week. French dermatologists recommend that people, even those with oily hair, not wash their hair more than once a week because doing so causes a greater amount of oil to be secreted. So if you ever see a Frenchman with stinky pits and oily hair, now you know why. They don't really bathe that much, even to this day. The metaphor used in the United States by doctors is that the body is like a machine that needs to be tended to regularly to ensure that it is running well. When there are problems with the body, it is often treated in ways that you might expect to see a machine repaired. And that's why we have a picture of a lady who looks like she has all of those metal parts. Now the reality is, my wife has metal hips, as weird as that is. So she already has this bionic mechanisms in her body. What else does she have? Oh, she had her neck fused. But she has titanium hips. U.S. medicine is known as the most aggressive in the world. Surgical procedures are used far more in the United States than in other countries where malfunctioning parts are removed, replaced, and or physically altered. And that's what we're going to do with this lady. I think she looks fine, but she's about to have a facelift. U.S. doctors are more likely than European doctors to use surgery rather than drugs. But when drugs are prescribed in the United States, they are prescribed at higher dosages than any other country. It is rare in the United States for a doctor to prescribe rest and relaxation as a curative agent. He might be kicked out of the AMA, the American Medical Association. One of the problems with this is in 2000, the AMA decided that they weren't controlling pain enough. I think I've told you this before. So the AMA decided that that doctors needed to do more in order to control pain. So they decided that we needed to be more aggressive. That they needed to be more aggressive. And one of the things that they did was suggest that they prescribe more painkillers. And this is where the hydrocodone and OxyContin epidemic came from. It came from the fact that instead of giving you a week's worth of OxyContin to take care of your sprained wrist, they gave you a month's worth. Well, how much did you need? Well, it went away in 10 days. If they'd given you a week, you would have been in pain for 3 days and then it would have been gone. Now they've given you 2.5 weeks more medication than you need, so you go ahead and take it. That's what they tell you. Go ahead and finish the prescription, and that'll make sure that you're all healed. Well, that may work with antibiotics, but with painkillers, what they were doing, they were creating addicts. And of course, now it has exploded, and we have all of these individuals who have gone on painkillers to control this or that or the other. This is what happened to Rush Limbaugh, he claims. And all of a sudden he was addicted. So he had to have these painkillers. He couldn't function without it. He had to make his radio program every 5 days a week, and he couldn't function without his painkillers. So he started buying painkillers off the street, and that's how he got in trouble. So let's give him a medal of American Medal of Honor or whatever they gave him. U.S. doctors tend to search for external causes of illness, such as bacteria and viruses. U.S. doctors prescribe more antibiotics than doctors from elsewhere, and Americans tend to have a greater concern for cleanliness and attempt to avoid contact with germs. And that is the end of today's lecture. That's the end of this week's lecture. So there you go. Let me turn this thing off. There we go. Okay, so next week we'll tackle the last chapter, and then we'll be